Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Metamodern Meaning podcast. I think that's what banner we're using to frame this conversation. I forget. Hold on. I think we did this as a Metamodern Meaning podcast last time, didn't we?
I think I heard you say something to that effect.
All right. All right. We'll go with it. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Metamodern Meaning podcast. Today I'm joined again by Layman Pascal to continue our conversation, which we began last time, exploring Layman's phenomenological state, the condition of his condition, and unpacking a bit in whatever modes and languages and semantic possibilities we can find to excavate the reality of all that a bit more. And so anyway, thanks for coming back, Layman. I appreciate this very much, and I find this a fascinating topic, but I also just appreciate you very much as a person. So this is a special delight.
And you're calling this sub-series Uncle Jim's Glistening Worm Farm?
Yeah, I was thinking, I don't know if that's the name of the series or if that's the name of the first episode, and we'll do a series of just, very ridiculous, off-putting titles so that, it's only people for whom they feel called to watch that kind of nonsense, they'll get this gold. So we'll see. But yeah, I think we framed it pretty well last time. I'd like to obviously continue exploring in this conversation stuff we didn't get into last time, but kind of carrying forward something that we did originally, which is a kind of beginning with a little check-in. Maybe you want to offer that from the get-go, kind of a first check-in of your condition and give that some words.
Yes. Embarrassing phenomenological self-exegesis. Um, it's actually interesting. I've had kind of a physically and mentally stressful and active day. So whatever I'm experiencing is not because things are going great. I'm cold and there was a bunch of tech problems and I hankered in on writing and all this stuff. So when I then check um, right now, first there's a blank, like a blank on the semantic register. It like returns no data without returning a missing data alert. So I have to switch to a phenomenology speculation mode. There's a This is a suboptical distortion. Let's say there's like a feeling of like a fold or a kind of like a parallax, and I'm not sure how close or far away it is. There's something here that's very content, and like I've been saying before, I can't tell if it's it or me or something else. I also can't tell if it's local or universal. It's appears to permeate my sense making field, both visually or let's say perceptually and cognitively. So when I check my mental map or my perceptual map, it's all the way through it. But there doesn't seem to be any way if I can tell whether that's the revelation of a primal condition or whether it's an overlay on everything. Um, there's a sense of, as I check it now, like a he was just here effect. Uh, One time I had this interesting vision of God. This was in my mid 20s, and it was like I kept like breaking through this feeling of a ceiling, and God was there, and he'd be like, "Good work, keep going," and he would push me back down. And then finally, I like struggled back up, and it's like the divinity was present, but the divinity was present as you just missed him. Like
Hmm.
this sort of was instantiated within the deferral of his own being. And I'm like, oh, it's just like that whole thing with the God man and the rock and the cave. And
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
you check on him, he's not there. So it has that kind of feeling. Like I can see phenomenological characteristics, but one of them is the sense of something's just vanished or shifted. There's a just somewhere elseness to it.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm curious too because it seems like there's this thing of checking on it, right? So if I were to say, "Hey, how you doing?" Yeah, maybe in kind of just a standard conscious state. one isn't immediately attuned to that, but it just takes a second to be like, well, I'm good, or oh, I'm a little bit hungry, or this or that. But when I ask you around checking in with the phenomenology of this, it sounds like there's a distinct cognitive move you have to do to like attend to this phenomenon that's not necessarily always um, in your field of attention. Or I don't know. Can you say a little bit more about that? Or
Yeah, I don't think that's any different than anybody else necessarily. I mean, I think you're sort of you're moving from your position, and then you can like metacognitively check in on your position as an additional feature. It seems to me that for a lot of my life, the check in was related to the components of the self, like body parts, emotional parts, mental parts, life situations, that kind of thing. And it was always a very confusing thing for me. I was always one of those people like didn't want to say fine, or like would try to really tell you how he was doing, or would denounce the question, something like that.
Mhm.
Uh, but this thing, yes, has to be checked on purpose. Uh, Operates uh, in addition to the other things that also have to be checked on purpose. Um, has become easier to check on, more salient. I imagine I have this sort of mental picture of it like creeping along, slowly growing over the course of my lifetime, and then crossing some kind of 51% threshold where it's like, when I do a self check, now it's the thing that stands forth in the self check. And then I could also check the rest of my condition. But previously, it would have been like, hey, there's the rest of my condition, and I could also check on this thing as it slowly came forward. So it has accumulated salience, and that could be itself the result of multiple checkings on it over
Hmm.
long periods of time. But I'm suspicious about the role that checking on it plays in the phenomenology itself.
Well, you brought something up I wanted to ask about anyway, but I'll come to that in a second. And it had to do with this sort of how gradual versus, kind of punctuated the shift is. But I was curious if, you know, compared to the last time we had this conversation and you did sort of a check in then, is there a difference in terms of intensity or like
Mm.
how malleable, how in flux is it? Or is it every time you go to check on it, it basically has the same essence to it?
There's something about its potential changes that I cannot gauge. So I am tempted to say something is not changing, but I want to be a little bit more epistemically humble and say I can't tell if it's changing or not. Then there's a set of um, yeah, moods, flavors. It's got a little bit of weather. Generally, it's pretty much the same. Uh, it seems to perk up, or when I tune into it, it causes some changes in the unit that seem to modify it a little bit. Uh, 30% variability.
Nice. Um, so yeah, that is then the question I wanted to get to next was around the gradualness of this coming online. And we spoke a little bit about this last time, but I'm just curious if you anything else you can add to that in terms of um, uh, when this that threshold element, right? And if there was like a has this been slowly accruing and building and then kind of flowering? Has it been just a linear thing? Has it been a exponential thing in terms of coming on?
Um, Telling a memory story backwards from this moment, there appears to be a gradual increase with punctuated maximal moments. So there's like many like mm, uh, mergers, outshinings, moments that you feel like you couldn't get beyond. Like that's as much of it as there could possibly be. Um, it breaks the chart. Lots of moments like that along the way. along a process of a gradual accumulation with something like uh, plateau like layers of various kinds. Definitely an intuitive, aspirational sense of wanting to go into certain kinds of practices was, I think, initially driven by a feeling of its already being present. But clarity on that was slow coming. And there was definitely a phase where something started to become very distinct, where um, my natural ability to refer to myself uh, became split or transparent. I heard somebody say walked through yourself, something like that. And I'm like, oh, I'm not, oh, that it started to become obvious that there was an ambiguity in the self relation.
How
And
long
that
ago was that?
the first time it persisted was probably the end of my 20s. Around then this thing happened where uh, it seemed like a passionate insight fueled breakthrough into my condition, followed by a cognitive complexification. But there was a quality to it that um, made started to make it seem like I was no longer the agent in my own unfolding. And then I think that so it like crossed, I don't know, 40%, 50%, wherever that started to really seem like it was the agent if I bothered to check. And then again, something in the last couple of years where another degree of its salience and the sense that maybe it's the agent has become much more extreme.
Do you feel like there is a current plateau like that is the state of it being off the charts, if that makes sense, or is that not a good way of describing that?
It's more like the difference between maxing and non-maxing is undermined.
Hmm.
So was really obsessed with these experiential self-maxing moments for a long time. But something seemed like it accumulated in the coming and the going from that, and got reinforced by moments of insight in which mm, options, dualities were did not seem viable. So what seems like a an increasing atmospheric or like an ambient accumulation of the non-difference between uh, the maxed version of it and the general version of it.
Yeah. So then another question I had, which kind of goes back to some of the original impetus for having this kind of conversation in the series, is that it seemed like you were there were some things that you were really interested in about this, but there weren't really a whole lot of opportunities to really explore because it's a rather kind of niche and specified sort of thing. So the question is something like, what is the edge for you at the moment that you're really interested in, that you're exploring the questions that this is bringing up, or however you want to go at that? But like, yeah, where's your current edge in terms of thinking about all this and deepening into it?
uh, Three areas come up to me immediately as um, areas of personal interest, and one is um, a certain kind of motivation is undermined by feeling like you have access to the thing that the motivation was seeking. So then, how do you ought one to then continue to do those things when the motivation is changed and just do them without the motivation or with a new motivation? Or should one not be doing them because they're completed and the process is just to be with the thing that they achieved? So that's an open question. I think there's an open question around mm, things like, well, maybe could be two different questions. One, is it local or universal? Is there any way to tell? Two, another one is is it an accumulation? Is it a conductivity, or is it an access to a prior condition? And three, what is the relationship between beingness and perfection? It seems like there's an interesting relationship between Vajra can be a hard word to define in English. Something like flashing, something like lightning, something like diamonds. There's a kind of a brilliant precision in all of those definitions, and it seems to me that if any evaluation implies some kind of relative calculation to the greatest possible value, which has a precise brilliance to it, um, accessing that in any given moment seems to drop me into an intensification of the ambient experience. And the ambient experience doesn't necessarily have that kind of mm, precise gold thing to it, but it does seem to have it in it somewhere. You can feel it like lurking around. You can lay your hands on it fairly easily. What is the relationship between these accumulated or accessed or conducted beingness type things and this other sort of uh, prior completeness points? That's intriguing to me.
Gosh, well, there's a lot in all of that, so I'm curious where to even start. I mean, um, I guess like starting maybe with the is it a universal or not question. Well, gosh, there's so much. All right. One question is, I mean, you'd have to kind of just dip into again your phenomenology again, but like these would all seem to be questions because the experience seems amenable to either interpretation, hypothetically. And so then the question is sort of like, is there like what about the experience sort of checks the box for either of those? And or is it something more like there's just this experience and so then there's the cognitive interpretation of it and that could be done any number of ways, but it seems like there would be kind of evidence, as it were, for either of these interpretive modalities. And um, like, I'm curious if you could speak to that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, the universal and the local, because there are ways of thinking where you're like, oh, you would have it locally and then you would go on to a universal. But then there's other ways of thinking where, like, you might experience it as universal, but you go on to understanding that it's local to you. What is it that one's looking at that could be read either way and that might demand a kind of languaging and structural analysis that implicitly contains its ability to go in either of those two directions? So I reach for words like pervasiveness. Um, like I said this earlier in our discussion today. It's pervasive across my perceptual and cognitive fields. So when I look around, it goes as far through everything I can detect as I can. And then when I think about what it might be, it goes as far as I can think about it through all my think about it structures. Um, and then you got some choices about what to say about that. Um, it's could be an illusory overlay, could be a non-illusory overlay, could be the revelation of a prior condition, could be the increased salience of the in-betweenness of things. But yeah, it's pervasive. It looks pervasive, and it feels like all things are permeable to it.
Well, you used a lot of language like
And then all things, right? That's what I'm cognitive and or perceptual
yeah.
fields.
But you use a lot of visual language for this, and I'm curious how much of that I mean, is there an actual sort of optic component, or is it in the sense of like the mind's eye seeing?
Yeah, two interesting things there. easy to check and talk about mentally, trying to like examine and do like a I'm just a guy reporting his condition kind of move. It's easy for me to go into the optical for that. It seems close to the mental. There are some things that seem almost optical, right? A little bit a fuzzy, and then like I said, that kind of I call it a suboptical distortion. They're as much haptic as they are optical, right? And then my
Wait, what do you mean by
uh
that? There is
I
much haptic.
mean, I don't know if I saw it or felt it, like haptic, like the way your body would appreciate a roller coaster move.
Mm.
And I'm like, oh, did I see a thing that looked like it had a wobble, or did I feel it and then imagine the structure of it?
Hmm.
It's subtle in either case. If I switch off optics, it has a this kind of body response, and there is a the whisper of a hum, all right, in the acoustics, in the, whatever they are, the psychoacoustics of it, a pleasant buzzing.
A big question I have, which I want to spend some time on, this is a good time to get into it, is um, refracting your experience through the language of various traditions, and what that does. And obviously, a lot of the value of this kind of conversational exploration is to, in some ways, sidestep some of the very traditional existing language and try to get more at the kind of just first person phenomenological accounting. But I'm curious. So the first question here would be something like, of the various traditions and lineages uh, that speak about various kinds of profoundly altered states and acquisition of traits, however you want to interpret that, are there particular versions that seem to align well with what you would feel like is your experience, and other versions that feel like that they seem further away than what it is that you're feeling?
I have a tendency to use sort of meta theory language, and one of the reasons for that is that things like first, second, third person are seem like an interwoven structure in this regard. So traditions where there's a very particular language around emptiness or God or the self, those seem a little insufficient because they're too far down one of the categories. Although, like in any tradition, you're going to find interesting exemplars who might sound a little closer to one's own experience. I've found a lot of utility in the haphazard phenomenological hints of Gurdjieff, although that's been imprinted on me, so it's easy for me to check on that kind of stuff. Certain elements of devotional non-dualism, and I would think of like Kashmir Shaivism and certain kinds of Sufi traditions get to the beatific. There's certain devotional qualities to it if you come in at a certain angle. There's certain kinds of um persistence of a relationship despite the sense of non-difference from that which is proposed as the relation. Uh, I usually think of some Sufism, some Zen, some Tibetan Buddhism, uh, certain 20th century mystics, usually iconoclastic figures. Um, but there's no special tradition that I think nails it.
Hmm.
I've spent a lot of time going down different traditional routes and realized after a while I was looking for something very specific in each of them. I was
Hmm.
not looking to take any of them on. I was only looking for places where they reflected some other journey.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean those ones are pretty good. Uh, one of the things I like about more shamanic orientations is that it doesn't worry too much about that kind of stuff. And I think my sense is that by and large we don't have a very good accounting of it. Right, there are definitely traditions in which people have done an almost microscopic analysis of their own phenomenological states, but how well that translates to others,
Yeah.
how well that can be correlated to neural conditions, how much of it's biased by the cultural and training assumptions they had going in or by their personality temperament. I don't think we know that stuff. So I think like this kind of thing strikes me as both embarrassing but also super useful to be
Hmm.
uh, try to be just as messy as possible and dig around in it and see what's there.
Yeah. Well, to embarrass you further, I wanted to wait to ask this question because I wanted to have lay a lot of ground here, but it relates to this topic, and it's the E word, which is to say enlightenment, right? When people throw around that word, it's an interesting history and a sense of what that has meant. Um, I mean, even within, say, Buddhist traditions, there's been a sense of, Buddha, the enlightened one, and there's a sense of specialness to that, maybe a kind of rareness or difficult to attainedness. But then, these other like traditions, particularly in the Zen tradition of like, this koan was said, and they immediately experienced enlightenment, and the whole crowd immediately experienced enlightenment. And there's like these different ways that kind of gets conceived. And similarly, I mean, there are different ways in which meditative states, like the jhanas, how attainable are they? Or, if you look across the traditions, sometimes it's like, oh yeah, then you do this and there you go. That's the first jhana. And other ones, like you look at I think, was it called the Visuddhimagga? And it's like, oh no, no, no. Like you've got to be an absolute sage before you even get a glimpse of the first jhana, these kinds of things. Anyway, so there's a lot of variability there. But I wanted to broach the topic in terms of the question of your phenomenological experience relative to what people think about as enlightenment. Any thoughts?
People are all over the map with a word like that, to the point where it seems almost useless, except as a vague go to one's own journey. Um, some people have a real comic book version of it, right? That I mean, did Buddha literally know everything and have superpowers? That's not what's going on here, if it ever went on anywhere. Um, the thing that I mean, I spent some time trying to figure out what I thought different uses of a word like enlightenment had in common. Is there something that moments of enlightenment, stages of enlightenment, and even the cultural historical enlightenment might point to? And it was part of the way I began to think about um, an excess coherence that spilled over the sum of its parts. And I think that's something you can have in moments and you can slowly accrue. I have not seen to my own satisfaction that what slowly accrued is necessarily the same as what's revealed in states. I've certainly been in states where it seemed to be more enlightened than I am right now, but um, this seems more reliable and less interested in those states. So there's a I don't think this is general. I don't think this would generally apply to words like that. I think it might apply to some people's usage of words like that historically. I can imagine someone more enthusiastic than myself trying to describe a condition like this with words like that. I find them misleading, off putting, and generally like too diverse a field to really tell us much, or at least it wouldn't tell us anything new.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, I'd want to do like a taxonomy. Like, even if I was thinking about, oh, there were moments of graceful or effort engendered, seemingly breakthrough conditions that had different sorts of qualities of um, experientially being already completely at the end, or seemingly knowing all the things that it's possible for a person to know, or you know, I still love koan breakthrough kensho states, which have this peculiar flavor of uh, like everything's answered before it's asked.
Mm-hmm.
But they all seem kind of specific. The states are specific, and also the skills are specific. Like jhanas, as interesting as they are, and that kind of, in an abstract sense, that notion of self-iterating layers of intensity that each have their own kind of flavor, that can be used very broadly to apply to a couple of different things. That might make it useful, or it might make it a bad conceptual tool. But I think of attention skills as skills, just like I would think of sort of subtle energy skills as skills. And that doesn't seem to be the same as what this is. This does not look to me like my experiences of climbing a jhana
Mhm.
charts. This looks like a thing that is mysteriously indifferent to those things.
Yeah, and I guess so. There's something I want to ask there, which is like, there are these notions of hierarchies of value and things like that, and we make hierarchies of various kinds. But in terms of um, doing a kind of basic ranking and comparison between this versus that, and which is sort of higher, or that we prioritize more or whatever, I'm curious if this experiential condition is, if you experience that as sort of like at the top of a kind of hierarchy of you know attainment possibilities, right? Sort of like, like in the same way that if you have a kind of insight, it can relativize previous insights. You're like, oh, what I thought was like the be all end all, after this experience, that totally changes the game on that. I realize now this is a whole other game than that. And I'm wondering if your condition feels like that now relative to other kinds of state practices where it's like, oh well, yeah, I'm not really interested in that because it's here's where the here's where it's at. Something like that. I'm curious about your hierarchicalization of these kinds of things.
That's tricky. It seems simultaneously like it could go on. Like, could there be 10 times as much of this? Maybe. But also, it seems like it can't be beat. But it just seems like, to me, it seems like it can't be beat for me. It doesn't seem like it's at the top of a hierarchy. It doesn't seem like it recontextualizes the relative position of other kinds of states and stages that I've either been through or heard about. It seems like it's either an other to all of those things or something that they have in common. Right? It has affected my behavior, my relation to those things. It's affected my motivation around those things. But I don't think it's at the top of a pyramid where those things are at a lower level.
Yeah, I guess I'm just, because that's also been part of various traditions where, they say, oh, yeah, when you do this meditation, the flashing lights, yeah, don't worry about the flashing lights. Doesn't really matter. And, that really intense bliss experience, yeah, it's not about that. And there's a sense in which there's a whole number of different states that can be experienced, some of them incredible. But it's like, yeah, but that's actually not so important because once you get this other thing, you realize that, those are cool, but they're kind of different. And I'm curious about the relationship of this in a similar sort of way, or and maybe I guess kind of like a related question, because there's, I mean, even in the story of the Buddha, right, he was following a particular kind of ascetic path, and then he was like, oh, that's not quite it, it's this other thing, right? And so there's a sense in which people can embark on a lifetime of spiritual practice in a particular direction, but if they're working on something that isn't this kind of other thing, maybe they're actually aiming for this other thing, but if they just think, oh, I'm going to get to it this way, that then they would be barking up the wrong tree, so to speak. So I don't know. There's a number of questions in there, but
It's very hard with these questions because it's so clear that the framework one chooses to play with in the answer constrains the answer. Like I have a I had a conversation with Greg Henriquez about inner practices relative to mind four and this notion of human general intelligence for an AGI world. There's a sense he was very interested in thinking about the difference between states that one could go into, or states that one could return to or retrieve from, let's say, more primitive layers of sense making. And the possibility of establishing um, not a higher consciousness, but a higher mind, which is to say, from his point of view, a way of reapproaching things, all kinds of things, rather than just having the experience. Kind of, what does it take for that experience to become
Mm.
the way people live, or like the spacesuit we wear in this weird world of ours? So I think about it a little bit in those terms. Like I feel like it might indicate an option for human growth that is able to interface with all kinds of other states and stages,
Hmm.
and would just add a different flavor and adjust the motivation to those sorts of things. But I don't. I'm trying to be careful in my own mind of to be on the one hand honest that it delights me. I prefer it to my best experiences,
Mm.
and all things being equal, I would probably recommend it. But that doesn't actually mean that it would be good for people or that it would be better than their best experiences or that it's necessarily anything other than something in myself which is so delightful I have no ability to get around it any.
Mm. But it does raise interesting questions, particularly to the degree that the communities we're involved in tend to orient to these questions of, however we want to call it, higher consciousness or developmental progression or new modes of insight, some kind of higher modality coming online in the collective consciousness that's going to be crucial for collectively up leveling at this moment of sort of meta crisis and moving into the world, into the future. With the kinds of capacities that we need for this kind of complexity. That's very much sort of the narrative backdrop for a lot of the spaces that we operate in. And it would seem to be important to get a better grip on then what that means, what that actually, what is the North Star there, right? And if some folks have a sense of, oh, well, we all just need to be doing more jhana practice, or we need to be, having more entheogenic experiences, or we need to be, well, let's just say having more peak experiences. Then hypothetically, if like, so to speak, that's not it, if that doesn't ultimately fit the bill in terms of generating a new kind of layer of mind, which is or would be more effective at that, that seems to be like meaningful information that we could glean from your phenomenological insights on your own condition. So it's a lot to put on you, but I'm just saying it's a question there.
Yeah. So different stories, different interpretive stories would arise depending on which bits of my practice life I would go like, oh, I've done a lot of this, and I start telling a biography where that's the case and it results in this. But because I can't tell which, if any, of my practices have caused which, if any, of my results, I end up looking at things that are more general across multiple types of practice. And so, what I'm tempted to think in terms of is the intentionality and the metacognition and the particular uses of these in terms of how we go in and go out of states rather than which states we get into, how we revise and recontextualize capacities rather than which capacities we get access to, how we um, create more visceral uh, metacognitive opportunities rather than just the relatively passive metacognitive opportunity of inspecting our arising contents or treating ourselves as an object, something like that. So I would tell a story where there's a slow accumulation of intentional metacognitive activity, particularly instantiated as experimental interactions across different sense-making systems available to the individual, and that one gains a certain fluency, but also there seems to be an opening of a different experience of self, motive, and sense making and emotion, and that space. I think of it like whipping cream. Like if you just just keep stirring it, and eventually it has a different, more delightful quality. Um, so that's a very rough sense of how I think something like a new cognitive experiential standard might emerge for human beings that is distinct from uh, trained states
Hmm.
or even gracefully incepted states. And I think to some degree different than the normal developmental complexification story. I don't
Yeah.
think it's identical to that either.
Yeah.
But I think it's capable of holding all of those things and of tweaking our relationship to them.
Lots of things coming up real quick. What briefly would you say is the relationship of the complexification vector to this, right? Like, is there some requisite level of internal complexity one does need to be able to do enough of those kinds of metacognitive practices that then, or is it a orthogonal thing from kind of, what we might think of as hierarchical complexity or any of that kind of stuff?
This is again very tricky, right? If we could make the assumption that this is some kind of bleed through of a primary existential background condition of reality. In that case, the right kind of posture, right? And maybe paramecium is capable of basking in this shit and then being affected by it in a certain way. That's down one interpretive tunnel. If we look at an interpretive tunnel whereby something is being built up, whether that's quantity like or is more like a conductivity access thing, then there would be a minimum amount of complexity needed, but that minimum amount could still be very low because uh, the background operations of the human nervous system seem to involve a lot of activities that would be considered to be metacognitive exercise if they were in the forefront of the mind. There's a lot of different systems running, they run into each other, we undergo suffering, we undergo ambiguous circumstances. We can adapt to a practice somebody gave us without knowing how that practice is operating and could be devoted to it and could have um, oh, maybe I can imagine somebody having a lot of this experience, way more than me, and thinking it was, oh, I've just attained the oneness of Krishna that my teacher told me about. Right. And I'd be like, I would look at it and be like, it's way more complicated than that. It's because it's doing this and it's doing this. And that's not what they say that thing looks like.
Mm,
So you don't need all that complexity necessarily.
mhm.
I think that complexity would be needed in order to flesh out how it actually works and how it would be deployed across variations of human beings
Mm.
of different types with different belief systems with different practice backgrounds.
Well, it also raises the question too, though, maybe their experience of it was just simpler if there's if a different way of putting this would be if Layman Pascal is a highly complex character, which I believe he is, maybe the level of complexity that you are experiencing in the phenomenon is through that lens that is not necessarily available to someone, I don't know, 10,000, 5,000 years ago or something. So the way that gets refracted through your own complexity is sort of like maybe it was the one for Plotinus, but
Yes.
for even a more complex mind, maybe it's like, oh, it's more complex than that. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, it would be lovely for ChatGPT to, because each moment of this discussion comes to here's a minimum set of alternative variants, right? So something like variant one, this can be experienced in a very simple way, or it could be experienced in a very complex way. That complexity was already there, but the simple version didn't see it. Option two, the complexity wasn't there. It only came to be there when you experienced it with the added complexity
Mm,
yourself. And then that could be historical,
yeah.
or it could be a thing that everybody goes through,
Mm,
or um, the complex version of it is something fundamentally distinct from what people might think of as the simple version. It's not a simple or
yeah.
complex version of the same thing. They're just two completely different things. So those three and or four would be all on the table, I think.
Yeah, I find very compelling the evolutionary idea of this in that sense too, where it's kind of what I'm not very familiar with Andrew Cohen's work, but I know that him and other people in this space were interested in enlightenment, is my understanding. Enlightenment itself evolving, essentially. And so it's not like there's this thing that people experience and it's been the same for all time. It's like that itself undergoes evolution and complexification. And so there's a way in which the participation in the experience through different more individuated folks with bringing greater levels of complexity to it, in a sense collectively up levels the phenomenon itself by means of what they're imaginally and sort of investing in this collective experience, if any of that makes sense. I find that a very interesting
I find it very interesting as well. I've spent a lot of time with models like that, and it adds an interesting additional factor where you think you have a special participatory role to play in helping that unfolding occur, and it
mm,
decenters the practice from your own benefits. You're like,
mm-hmm,
I'm helping enlightenment evolve. I'm not worried about getting enlightened.
yeah.
That's good. That's nice. I like that. But I think we talked a little like in terms of like how this thing likes me to talk. It's clearly high hits a couple of points repeatedly. One is it wants to come back to a circulating space between the interpretive options.
mm,
Two is it wants to come back to fundamental limits because I'm like, yeah, I spent a lot of time with those enlightenment itself as evolving models, but now I would say I just don't know. There's no way to tell,
uh,
right? Which is it. There's a happiness
yeah.
uh, uh, when I say that,
Uh-huh.
and the happiness is around keep it personal, keep it human, bring forward the dynamic inter thing, but also bring forward the fundamental limitation and the
Mm,
happiness of fundamental epistemological interpretation.
yeah. The joys of Kant or something like that. I have another question, but let's do another check-in. Drop in on your condition. Um, give it some words.
Uh, it's brighter, it's closer, it's cheerier, it's more up and around rather than just hanging out. It's changed my chemistry, um, the way my body, nervous system, emotions felt when I sat down has been uh, this thing feels more like that thing than it did when I last checked in.
Hmm, interesting. Um, so I want to come back to this other thing about motivation that you said, one of these leading edge questions for you, because I'm curious how these other kinds of practices then relate to this condition. And you said, do you stop doing them because you feel like, is this potentially the result of that? So it's sort of gratuitous, or not. And one of the, or, I mean, the or not question is specifically when you sit down to do certain kinds of practice, does it enhance, change, alter, modify, increase, augment, or whatever your experience, or is it sort of a wash and you're like, I didn't need to do that because I'm already there or something? So I'm curious about that.
It's a very mixed bag. um, the motivation for a bunch of practices has fallen away. And some of those practices I either don't practice or practice much less often. Now, certain practices I practice a little more often, but the stakes are lower, let's say. It does feel like there's a result you want to get, but also the reason you wanted that result is something you already have before you start to practice. So a lot of practices are partial or porous versions of their previous form. There's also a love for practice in general and for certain types of practices in particular, where you go, I don't feel the way I felt when I really, it was necessary for me to do these things to uh, save my life or save my sanity or not be a meaningless existential creature, right? That thing isn't there. But also, you're like, it's this habit too. You've been doing this shit for years, so it kind of goes by itself, like brushing your teeth. But then you're like, These are great. Like, even if these practices had no effect, I might keep doing them because they're just so wonderful.
Hmm. So
It's like having
give some
going for a
examples.
really nice walk in the woods. You're like,
Yeah.
if it wasn't having positive health benefits and it was that delightful, I might do it anyway.
Yeah. Could you be specific about some of these practices, some of which you've lost interest in, some of which you'd keep doing anyway? Um,
I used to do a lot of practices working with the abstraction of consciousness itself. Um, Trying to be conscious of consciousness, trying to hold my attention on the point from which it felt like my knowingness was emerging, trying to focus on the quality of focusing on things and then intensify that. Just being attentive to the phenomenology of awareness itself. That has no interest to me anymore. It's
hmm.
like I'd be like, why? It doesn't seem like there's any action going on with consciousness. Um, I mentioned periodically I still like koan practice. Uh, I'm less interested than I used to be in terms of the Kensho shift, and more interested in the exercise of, like, there's a weird structure of sense making that goes on in those things, and you're like, and somehow that structure is a language for letting something articulate itself. You're like, oh, how did they talk? How did they say that? How do I say this? Those things are delightful. Some practices are restorative or super useful for the organism. You're going to open if you're emotionally stuck, or relax yourself if you're tense, those sorts of things. I don't do as much concentration work as I used to, or it's woven into the other practices. But I used to like focus on a thing on purpose for a while, and that could be a dot, or it could be a zone, or make myself think about this on purpose, or try to make myself have this feeling on purpose, try to be more intentionally on top of what's going on in the system rather than just responding to it. But certain kinds of insight practice reflect the disposition of this whatever it is to my life and to the world. So I do like practices where I sit, and whatever comes up is like seen into or made fun of by this thing, and then opens as a result of that contact. There seem to be practices that involve uh, actively assimilating impressions, and that feels delightful and necessary, like the daily consumption of food and water. These There's a lot of interesting play around these sort of prior completion things that I was talking about, which I run through a Nietzschean lens of, you sort of, he who hates himself still honors himself as one who despises, right? Your evaluation in any given moment, how you're experiencing and evaluating the world, because everything's sort of value laden if you're an experiencer. Uh, the value is connected to the maximal possibility of evaluation, right? You're giving this thing 5% of the total possible value, or 10% or 80%. And you're like, oh, I could just give it 100%. Where's that 100%? And you can kind of locate the maximal value spot, the Vajra Bindu, whatever we want to call it there. That's very fun. It's like a video. A lot of these actually are kind of gamified for me now, when you're kind of like, you just like, there's a relaxing sort of open things up, or find the gold coins kind of move to it.
Yeah.
And then there's also uh, it doesn't mean much to me to spend time just evoking coherent love for this thing, but intersubjective fields, it really likes when I just love those. It's got a very strong preference in that regard. Uh, and that involves a kind of aligning of systems or kind of opening and then a returning to a coherence thing. And it feels very mm, secured all the way around and back when I'm doing that.
Hmm. Okay, question. So
I feel like I'm being extremely vague.
no, it's hard probably not to be to some degree. I mean, anytime you talk about anyone talks about their phenomenology, so this is why these things are very rich and important, I think. A question though, to stick on the practice front for a second. I mean, I'm curious around again this thing of it's like there's this conception, or I guess I'll just own this. Maybe I have this conception that it's sort of people talk about different spiritual practices as though like, do this thing, like this is what, you want to keep doing this because it will lead to the thing. Like, oh, okay. But then these people are talking about that too. And then it's like, well, okay, that's a rather different practice from that, but okay. And then you're like, presumably, maybe somehow like that the thing is just accessed through these different kinds of various practices or not. And what I'm intrigued by with your case is it almost sounds like uh, this condition that you're in now. Um, it seems like some practices don't really have any bearing on that, or they're kind of like unrelated to some degree. And I'm curious about that. And maybe you would disagree with that characterization, but I'm getting the sense of like someone wants to learn how to play the piano. They want to play Chopin, and they like, okay, so you do Hanon practices and triads, and you just run your scales and all that. Now that's important when you learn to play Chopin eventually and you're a gifted pianist, you don't really necessarily have to keep up with those sorts of things because you're playing that. So some things fall away that were necessary to get to where you want to be. And that's one category of things. But then there's like golf. And it's like your golf game is not going to impact your ability to play Chopin so much. And so, but maybe you don't know that until you're playing Chopin and you're like, oh, yeah, that whole golf thing. I took up golf because I wanted to play Chopin better, but that actually has no bearing on this, whatever. And or you could say, I love golf. Golf is fun. I mean, it's really I'm mostly drawn to playing Chopin, but I enjoy the game of golf. And then it's sort of like, so anyway, if all this is making sense, it seems like there are these various practices, some of which lead to potentially um kinds of state experiences that lend themselves to the kind of condition that you're describing. Some of them may be totally orthogonal and unrelated, and yet still of value in some various way, or maybe just fun for you. But I'm interested in one, I guess, the question of, are there specific practices maybe that you still do or have done in the past but maybe don't need to do or want to do anymore, that are sort of directly conducive to the condition you're in, and then there are others that you just do for fun. And if there's some kind of a track or a vector that you can situate these various practices along that lead to that or have little bearing on that. There's a bunch of questions in there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, this would be a fun. Let's sit down on the floor with a giant piece of paper for a couple hours and see if we can put things in those categories. Um,
Oh,
it's a little
maybe.
bit different than playing the piano in a certain
Yeah.
regard, and like because there's like a black box effect. It's very straightforward when you're playing the piano, because I'll do the same. Like, okay, maybe should I, which exercises should I keep doing? There's exercises which, in my imagination, it wants me to do, it
Hmm.
likes.
Hmm.
And then there's ones where I'm like, there's probably like basic functions that it either is directly derived from or relate to my basic tone that it counts on me having. So I have to keep stabilized in that regard.
Hmm.
And there's probably a lot of practices that are not important because they're too primary. And probably a lot of practices that had no bearing and some which are just delightful. But which ones are which? Like, I don't think you can necessarily tell in terms of inner practice which ones were a preliminary, because very often experienced practitioners end up going back and speaking in terms of the preliminary practices and not in terms of the more complex sounding ones. But you just don't see the straight up connection, and odds are you're doing multiple practices over the period of time in which you might be able to see which things cause what.
Hmm.
So it's like you're finding yourself playing Chopin. And then you're like, okay, what did I do yesterday?
Yeah.
I did talk to a guy about Chopin. That might have been related, but I also had a turkey leg. Could that be related? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I guess another related question there is like you say you do still enjoy the koan practice, and is that because you just find it delightful, or because you feel some kind of connection to your condition? Or is it just like it could be this other way of thinking discursively that you find that is cool and maybe is opens up the path to some other ways of being, but has actually like little bearing on your condition.
Okay, yeah, great example. So it does several things, right? For me, koan practice is mediated to a strong degree by falling in love with particular historical koan practitioners. And part of that falling in love is feeling like they're speaking to something similar that one is working on oneself. Second of all, I feel like there's a toolkit, there's a gymnasium there for helping this thing to do more, to speak itself more clearly, to articulate the particular skeleton of its strangeness back to itself.
Mm.
Um, and then, it could be, depends if you want to buy into like a multi-life thing. You're like, oh, that feels like I often feel myself being such a practitioner in such a place long ago.
Mm.
I don't give a lot of credit to those feelings, but that could be a factor in there. Could be like some having an imaginal temperamental disposition in that regard. But I do feel like there's something in certain kinds of developmental practice and certain kinds of non-dual practice that converge and remind me of what I think this is
Mm.
and help it extrude its tendrils.
How accessible is this to the intellect alone? Is a question. I mean,
I
what?
just checked the intellect alone and got nothing. So I don't know.
I guess I've been curious about the relationship, say, between contemplation and meditation in some of the ways that I don't know, John Vervaeke will talk about it, where the meditation kind of vector is into the suchness of things. It's non-discursive. It's just like the being state. And then the contemplation vector is sort of in the other direction of like increasing abstraction and, this kind of philosophical, platonic kind of thing that leads you up into the oneness of the mind and all this stuff. This is my interpretation. So, not to impugn either Vervaeke or other people, but I see a kind of interesting dialectic at play there. And some people will say, and there's even like I think in Eastern traditions, the notion of the jnana yoga, right? Of like the yoga of the mind, as it were. And I'm obviously as a dispositionally and attracted to matters intellectual, and I find a lot that draws me up in that. But I also see inherent limitations to what the mind alone can do, absent sort of digging in either to the suchness or other kinds of embodied practices and various kinds of things that integrate subsystems, etc. So I'm just curious of like um and I'm also mindful of people watching this or listening to it and trying to think about it. Like, is there a benefit to, or even a path in exploring what you're describing, somatically and embodiedly and all this, primarily, if not solely, through a kind of intellectual lens, or does it just it needs a practice component that is deeply somatic and embodied?
It's not clear to me that everyone's nervous system has um, as much sentient access to its affects and somatics. I don't think that's gender. Like some people have feel like they have a very direct feedback from their nervous system out of the body into the nervous system. Some people have very strong responses to emotion. People who don't have those same responses, it's not like they don't have emotion or they don't have somatic experience. It's just not necessarily being reported to the nervous system the same way. But I think we do need to be careful if we were like talk to somebody who their self-description was, I'm doing a very intellectual procedure. That doesn't mean they're not also doing these other procedures. For me, the uh, it's become very important to try to use multiple systems simultaneously. I definitely have put a lot of my attention over the course of my life into the somatic container, so that even if I were to do something that on paper sounds very intellectual, I'm probably doing it as if the intellect is functioning as part of the chamber
Yeah.
of the whole sense of the body, and also it's thinking towards a feeling state of some kind. It's the thoughts are have an emotional motivation and an emotional target condition. So that said, um, nobody knows, right? Like whatever. How do you know you're only doing it purely intellectually, right? You're following something, and it's not clear what system's active. If it's of interest, where there's interest, any number of systems could be at play. So I think following your interest is a way in under almost any condition. Kongan practice has some ways of using the intellect to transcend itself, although the moments of breakthrough are moments of real bodily and emotional struggle. Great ball of doubt, great ball of certainty. Those are both emotional conditions. But your mind can build up uh, affective charge, can build up intensities, these sorts of things. The, the mind's encounter with its own limit conditions seems to me very something that I often pursued, that feels connected to the way I am now.
Mm.
For example, that's what I always heard when I would listen to Descartes. I heard the same thing I heard reading Dogen or Hakuin.
Mm.
I like, oh, this person is thinking to the mind's limit. And when they get there, there's nowhere else for the mind to go. And under normal conditions, people might, they don't seem very clever necessarily, person you run into at the bus stop, but they might be thinking all the time, right? Just because it's a low grade intellect doesn't mean they're not just using the intellect constantly. They might be extremely intellectual in their responses to the news or their family or whatever. But there's a sophisticated use of the intellect, which is, can I find places where it can no longer operate on its own terms? If you can think to the boundary of minds, then the mind holds itself in check and another function is opened that
Mm.
can be processed in various ways. But there's a lot of possibility there, and there's a lot of freeing, and there's a sense in which um, if we're talking about this in terms of integration across subsystems, and then this is all in speculation rather than phenomenology, but the binding of two functions of intellect together to a place where they can't separate, which is what a lot of non-dual discourse does. That's a place where those two systems are now yoked in the yogic sense.
Mm.
And so that contributes to the accumulation of a coordinated intersystem sensibility.
Yeah. Well, in the last 5 or 10 or so minutes, what would you like to bring into this conversation? Something we haven't touched on that is alive for you, or just feel like you'd want to throw into the mix?
Archetypes or moods of this thing,
Hmm.
it's interesting to bring it up in terms of the intellect question. There's a quality of uh, warrior like mind strength that one sees in sort of Zen and in some of the interesting psychological results that were obtained by the ancient philosophical contemplators. And it seems like there's a solidity there, and the mouth is straight. It's not the same as that one, and yet it seems equally available. right? It's like there's a suit of mind armor this thing can put on to extend itself, just as much as there are particular emotional states or particular forms of logic that can be used. So I find it, uh, you see the images of like the Buddha of wrathfulness or something, and you're like, oh, does this thing have an itself of wrath and itself of joy and itself of reasoning? That's of interest to me. Um, Also, the possibility that it can have mutational effects on other systems. The famous thing of Ramana Maharshi claimed he enlightened a donkey. Sri Aurobindo thought, "Oh, I've got this thing now. I'm going to see if I can, radiate the particles of matter around me with this. If it's an actual general cosmic phenomenon of some kind, then that may be the case. Whether it's the case outside of yourself or outside of your own like bioelectric field, or whether it's only the case inside your organism and its functions, there's still this sense of what could it do? Does it have effects? Is it bleaching out my soul? Is it tweaking my mitochondria? I kind of want it to, but also I can't totally trust it. But still, let's see what happens.
Hmm.
That sense that there might be an ongoing process of conversion in a particular direction. I think that's an interesting thing to explore.
I mean, does that relate to, powers, so to speak, like in the cities, SIDDHI, and these kinds of things? Are you talking about leveraging this conscious surplus that is you and beyond you to the manipulation of physical objects?
No, that's not what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I mean, that could be the case. I don't really have much interest in it. I'm talking about the possibility of causing a particular flavor
Mm,
to exist.
mm.
Now, there may be, I mean, odds are there are uh, unexplored functions to the neuroorganism, some of which human beings have experimented with, some of which we probably have not, some of which are produced by particular practices and stresses, and some of which might unfold in a more spontaneous fashion if the hatching light is properly lowered over the chicken eggs. That's something I saw when I was a kid. Um, but I'm not thinking of like causing effects.
Mhm.
I'm thinking of hmm, getting the stink of this thing on other things.
Well, when you put it that way, no thanks. Talk about radiating light. That sounds a little better. Um, that's interesting. So a kind of yeah, a positive contagion of some kind.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. I think like radiation is an interesting metaphor because a radioactive thing can cause other things to be radioactive to a
Mm.
certain extent.
Do you have any thoughts around if that were in the realm of possibility, thinking about what people have meant by words like transmission? Do those go together or are they distinct phenomena?
I think they probably are closely coupled.
Mm.
Um, I've done a lot of studies on transmission dynamics. There's things I like to play with. There's things which happen whether I play with them or not. It's very easy to exaggerate what all those processes are. They need to be on the table. It seems like I'd be curious if anybody ever listens to this and can make sense of a damn thing that I'm rambling about. I have a tendency to feel like there's an increase of transmissive potential where people do something like articulating their existential condition,
Mm.
right? Regardless of what that condition is. Like if two people get together and really tell each other how they feel, the odds of a love affair go up compared
Mm.
to if they don't mention any of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there is a dynamic there, and maybe it's just built into the imaginative mirroring functions of other human beings. But we are also constantly in communication with different scales of reality in different ways. So I don't know, what all is being positively contaminated into the world through me or not. Um, I used to really love the idea of having radiant subliminal effects,
Mm,
and now it's that idea is not as happy as I am.
mm. Well, I find you a wonderfully stinky contagion. So much appreciated. No, this is great. I could ask you now or just pose it rhetorically, but I'm curious for our next iteration of this, what you might want to explore, some potential themes or topics that we could delve into that we haven't yet.
Yeah, and I mean, my guess is we probably, no matter what we say now, it'll just sort of unfold in that one. But there's already been a bunch of things that we could go, I think, much further into.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, I'm I'm finding myself a little bit torn. I mean, initially there's this sort of this something obscene about just articulating your condition as if it's some special thing, but this interplay between, am I trying to speak coherently in terms of my spiritual analysis and philosophical picture of how these things operate, or am I trying to put all that aside and just
Mm,
pull the innards out and throw them around?
mm,
I find myself going back and forth. I'm not sure if we're doing another one whether we want to lean in one of those directions on purpose or not.
mm,
I think this question about uh, ambient beingness and perfections, I think that's probably worth exploring. This thing about archetypes of it came up
mm,
unexpectedly. I think the question, I mean, these are the questions of sort of, when you asked about the leading edge queries. I mean, I think accumulation, conductivity, or primal access, that's such an unresolved conundrum. They all seem to potentially apply, that it would be great to, get the have the dog get the bone in its teeth, not the bone, like grabbing a Raggedy Ann doll and
yeah,
biting the
yeah,
hell out of it until the
yeah.
innards are exposed in those three areas.
Uh, Great. Yes. Well, I will review this one and the previous one and see
Then
what
burn
seemed to
them.
surface and what's that?
I will review them and then burn them.
No, I'll see what elements came up that I'd like to dig back into, but those are all great. And Yeah, this has been delightful.
I would
So
be very interested to have a chatbot run through the transcripts
oh
afterwards
yeah.
and try to organize, taxonomize some of the elements we're discussing.
That's a great idea. That's a really good idea. Yeah.
That would free me to be even more wantonly haphazard in this
Yeah, well,
discussion.
and also to answer that last question that you brought up, I would like to get more into the innards part. I mean, part of the attempt or the invitation for you to kind of keep checking into the state is just an opportunity for you to just to surface other things from the phenomenology of it. Whereas, the theory and all of that's going to come pretty naturally anyway. But however you'd like to surface whatever those innards are, I'm yeah, I mean, because to really to start not with the theory, but to start from the condition and the experience, and then try to move out from that. It seems really important for obvious reasons. So, um, my friend, thank you so much. Greatly appreciated, and yeah, to be continued.
Good to see you.